Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall, and today I'm joined by...
Jason Kuznicki of the CATO Institute.
Yeah, thanks for coming on with me, Jason. We want to talk about a couple different things, but first off, the anti-religious discrimination laws that are currently being considered in Kansas and Arizona and a couple other states that are a little less publicized. But we'll focus on Kansas and Arizona today. And the Arizona religious freedom of religious conscience law, I don't exactly know what to call them, has passed the legislature and is going to the governor, who has been urged by a bunch of different politicians, including both Republican senators from the state, to veto it. But generally, what the laws are kind of intended to do is to provide a balance against these cases that we've heard in the last few months of usually Christian laborers who are refusing services for gay weddings. So, I believe it was in New Mexico, a baker was sued by a gay couple for refusing to bake a cake for their wedding. And we've seen that in a couple different places around the country. Jason, you wrote a couple interesting things to me on Twitter, and I wanted to get kind of your perspective on this, not exactly from a legal standpoint, but kind of from a philosophy of government standpoint. And I don't want to paint you as the representative of libertarianism, but I did want to get your libertarian perspective on this legislation that's making its way through these state legislatures.
Sure, yeah, and I should stress I'm not a lawyer, but the first thing I would want to know is why exactly would I, as a gay man, want products or services provided by people who obviously think very little of me or hold me in contempt? Or why would I want to give them my business? And a lot of the examples that have been cited so far as reasons that justify these types of laws have been, very small, very symbolic things like wedding photography or a wedding cake. I don't want to eat a wedding cake that's been provided by someone who thinks that I am evil and going to hell. I would just as soon take my business elsewhere. And because this isn't this is a non-emergency service. This is not a matter of a government agent or a representative of the state treating me unfairly. I'm inclined to think that maybe we can agree just not to do business with each other, and maybe that's the most satisfying outcome altogether. I don't see why I need to compel their businesses.
Right, that's a good point, and I think it goes back a little deeper, more that sexual orientation is not a protected class in America under the 14th Amendment, and going back a couple of years when Senator Rand Paul first got elected, he got in a bit of hot water by saying he wasn't sure if he would have agreed with the Civil Rights Act, making race a protected political class in America. And that seems to me to be a pretty prevalent opinion on the libertarian right. That these carve-outs for protected classes for which you're not allowed to discriminate in certain ways, certainly in the provision of services from businesses, and it does seem, and I think that this has been a criticism widely leveled at kind of libertarian-ish type politicians and thinkers and things like that, is that if sexual orientation isn't a protected class, what is and who's not to say that race shouldn't be a protected class in a similar way? And do you kind of find that critique to be applicable here?
Well, actually, I don't. I think what Rand Paul said about racial discrimination is actually really unfortunate, and it's very, very easy to make the case that a few types of discrimination are particularly disfavored by our Constitution and by our our entire history. Looking back at how various groups have been treated and their success or failure at rectifying what was eventually perceived as or was perceived by them all along as bad treatment. So, for example, it took 3 separate constitutional amendments to make things right on paper following the Civil War, and even then, things were not right in practice for a very long time afterward. It took many, many different attempts at legislation in Congress before things finally were even close to right in the courts, and before we could get the courts on board with preventing racial discrimination. And I should say, I think that race occupies a very special place in American history. It's, if anything, the founding sin of our country was the unfair treatment based on race and the system of slavery that we've spent so much time trying to get away from and to uproot the bad after effects of. I think that things are very different for gays and lesbians. There has been appalling treatment of gays and lesbians, of course. There still, I'm sure, will continue to be cases similar to that, but really what we've seen in gay and lesbian history has been very, very different. There has not been a protracted period where people said, look, we should be treated fairly, and other people said, well, yeah, but we're not going to. That's what you saw with race. With gay and lesbian issues, things have changed within just a few decades, very, very short amount of time, and relatively little federal legislation of any kind to make it happen. People's attitudes have simply changed. And that, to me, is, first of all, it's good news. As a gay man myself, I'm very thankful for that, and I'm glad that, in some respects, my fellow Americans are able to see reason. I like that. But then it raises a very difficult question, which is how do we fairly treat the people whose views are sincerely in the opposite direction? There's a quote from Michael Brennan Doherty, which I really appreciated, that he wrote last week. He said that one of the problems with what people on the left are trying to do with this particular struggle is that they're turning it into a sort of a weapon against the right in a way that it really shouldn't be. And his quote was, "The arc of the moral universe is long, and those who disagree with me should be impaled on it." I don't agree with that. I think that those who disagree with me ought to be able to run their own lives as they see fit. And if that means that perhaps I have to go elsewhere for a wedding cake, I think I can handle that.
Okay, so you're arguing the history of discrimination when it comes to sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is not is not as pervasive, is not as deep, is not as inherent to American life as racial discrimination has been in the past. And to me, you're saying, that we've experienced a fairly rapid movement on acceptance of homosexuality in American society, and that perhaps even in the near future, it's not something that's going to be all that concerning.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I see people talking about this Arizona Bill 1062 and saying that it's the new Jim Crow, and to me that is it's wrong on 2 counts. First of all, it's not Jim Crow because it's going to be allowing a very small number of businesses to operate in a way that, yes, certainly is discriminatory, but is not going to lead to a pervasive discriminatory culture. And second, it's not new because the default rule in the United States for businesses is that they are allowed to discriminate in all of their business dealings. They're allowed to choose the people that they will or will not do business with. And we've only made a few exceptions. General rule. Race is one of them, and I think is by far the most justified of them. And the question now is, should sexual orientation also be one of them? One of the things I actually find really inspiring about the gay rights movement is that it has successfully, voluntarily persuaded people to abandon discriminations, voluntarily persuaded companies to adopt non-discrimination policies without threat of legislation, because they understand that this is actually a good business practice to not discriminate, to take people as they are, and to hire on the basis of merit without regard to sexual orientation. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think that is, I suppose, a more libertarian way of looking at it is that it is more impressive of a triumph if you keep state policy out of it, right?
Right.
I think
And
that
you could ask, well, why couldn't that have happened with race? And there are a variety of reasons for that, but the biggest one is that for many decades, state policy was firmly on the other side. It prohibited integrating businesses rather than allowing businesses to choose as they wished. In fact, said no. If you're going to provide rail service, for example, you have to provide segregated cars, and this really just settled the matter, but not in a good way.
right, and I think you made an interesting point in that discrimination or allowing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation basically is the law of the land right now. There is sexual orientation is not a protected class, so it is up to largely private businesses to to institute their own, and many of them have, and many of them will continue to in the future. And what I think is something to be aware of, and I'm not entirely sure that this is necessarily going on here, or that it's the motivation behind it, but the expressed intent of both the Arizona and the Kansas law are specifically aimed at gay weddings, right?
That's right.
That and it's not necessarily written in the best way. And Adam Serwer, I think at MSNBC, had a good piece on this today, and how they're written a bit broadly, and they could be interpreted more broadly than that. But that if you're say a hotel that just services the general public, you should not be. These laws would not allow you to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation unless you were a hotel that catered solely to married couples, and you said, this gay married couple is not something that I sanction, so I can turn them away.
Yeah, I mean, that really does point to what I think is a key point of the whole discussion, is that this is in a lot of ways a controversy over symbolic law. It's a lot like flag burning. Instances of flag burning are very rare. They almost never actually happen. Almost always, when they do happen, everyone thinks the person who's burning the flag is an idiot and it hurts his cause. But you will always find people beating the drum for a flag burning statute to prevent this from happening. Well, it's going to be very rare. This is going to be an exceptionally rare occurrence that laws like this even come into play. Really, it is, in a way, I would say, a face-saving gesture for people on the religious right, and I'm not as troubled by it as a lot of people on the left are, I suppose.
Right, but I wouldn't say that the amount of consequence that legislation is going to have invalidates the passion behind it, right? So, I mean, a lot of people are passionately in favor of legalized flag burning. You know, that really does animate people. Even though, I mean, there are very few cases where flags are burned every year, and we see it kind of in the developing world, where we see our quote-unquote foreign enemies burning American flags, and we get all riled up. But on American soil, generally, people do have really strong feelings about it, even though it's really rare. And that might apply here, you know, that there would be a very, very small number of businesses that would have discriminatory practices reinforced under these laws. But it's still important because of how strongly some people believe in this, to push back on that.
Yes, I mean, I'm not the arbiter of your particular religion, and if this is your sincerely held belief, I am inclined to let you have it. One of the arguments I've seen in favor of laws like this Arizona 1062 is that, look, the Christian religion doesn't forbid you from providing cakes for gay weddings. It doesn't forbid you. It's not in the Bible. There is nothing unchristian about doing this. You're just operating a business, so relax. And what I would say to that argument is these people obviously have a different view of Christianity than you have. I'm not a Christian. I'm not even a religious believer. But I recognize, perhaps in part because of that reason, that allowing a very wide latitude for what people believe religiously is very important. It's part of what makes America special. And the fact that I think that their own particular conclusions, their own reading of the Bible, perhaps, the fact that I think those things are wrong or even absurd is not an argument for forbidding their exercise.
That's true. And what's interesting about this, and might be more relevant in the future, is that the court system largely is tasked with kind of adjudicating between sincere religious belief, maybe false religious belief, and American law. We have broad religious exemptions for, the slaughtering of meat and the consumption of drugs, and based
fairly
on
narrow for the consumption of drugs, actually, but yeah, they do exist. And the IRS went back and forth for a while on whether Scientology was a religion, but I understand that it actually is counted as a religion now. And if you've ever looked into Scientology, I mean, it's some real, far out there nonsense. But that said, it qualifies as a religion, and we allow people in this country to go where their conscience takes them. That's important, I believe.
And what I kind of see this moving towards, and this kind of touches on a series that Eugene Volokh at the Volokh Conspiracy and now the Washington Post had last week on the very strong claims to religious exemptions that conservative Christians have been making. Logically have to apply to some religions that conservatives might be uncomfortable with. So, we see a lot of hand-wringing in the conservative community over Sharia law and its practice within the borders of the United States. And some of that comes into clear conflict with American criminal law, but around kind of the fuzzier borders of that, a lot of these strong claims to religious liberty and freedom of conscience, will apply there. So to me, that's a pretty interesting kind of riposte to this newfound conservative fervor for religious conscience and freedom of religion exemptions from American law.
It is. I mean, in a sense, religious liberty, if it's done right, is almost always a deal with the devil. You are making a deal with people whose religious views you think are false and evil, and that will lead their followers into eternal damnation. That's just how it works. We all agree to find a way to live together, not to find a way to get to heaven together. That's not what we're after. And if we allow, for example, the Jewish religious authorities to exercise arbitration authority over marriages performed in the Jewish faith, then allowing that same authority to Muslim religious authorities is only right. I mean, there's no getting around it. It's been argued, I think, absurdly, that Islam is not a religion. I think Eugene Volokh did a very good job demolishing that claim. He said, look, this is certainly a religion. It is a set of beliefs about God and about salvation and about ritual purity and about ethics and about how people are to treat one another. All these things are found in Islam just as they are found in Christianity. If Islam is not a religion, it's hard to say that Christianity is a religion, because it's very similar in all of those respects. So yes, we'll have to agree to disagree, and that's unfortunately how life works. We would all like to run the world the way that we see as best. We would all like to be in charge of everything, but the problem is that societies that run that way turn out very, very badly. We don't want to enforce uniformity across the entire country in religion, or in spiritual life, or in matters of conscience. It ends up a mess, and we know this from European history, from the horrible wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, that attempting to make one view triumph over all others usually works out to be just a bloodbath.
Right. And so in general, I see, very religious conservatives and libertarians on the same side of this issue, but I see them being motivated by different forces, right? So the religious conservatives are motivated by what we would call sincere religious belief, and that what sincere religious beliefs are should be kind of exempted in some of these fuzzy ways. We see it in the contraception mandate, for example. But on the other side of the coalition is kind of more generally pluralistic, that America is a place where lots and lots of people have lots of different values, and we have to kind of tolerate that, be it religious or not, if we're all going to live in a society together, right?
Right, I think that's fair. Yeah, I would point to the fact that I am pro same-sex marriage, and actually am in a same-sex marriage, as evidence that I'm not coming at this from some kind of crypto-religious right perspective. I'm just not.
Right, just for the record.
Yeah, it should be pointed out, yeah.
But I wanted to kind of explore that pluralism, I guess. And you wrote an article for libertarianism.org last month about how the progressive movement's kind of adoption of paternalistic, technocratic governance is going to inevitably kind of quash a lot of this pluralism that's inherent in society, because it's not really, it's more about trying to, in some cases nudge, in some cases force people into different modes of behavior than they currently have.
That's right, and there's an enormous temptation, I think, more on the progressive side than on the conservative side, toward what I like to think of as SimCity government. There's this whole generation of people my age or so that grew up playing the game SimCity, and in it you're a city planner, and you decide where things go, and you decide how the taxes are going to be set, and you decide where the roads are going to be built, and you make all kinds of very minor adjustments to all these things continuously, without any kind of legislative compromises to be made, or without any kind of regard for individual liberty. If you want to, uproot a residential district and put in a shopping district, nobody ever asks about the justice of it. You just do it, and you can watch the people come and go constantly. And you have this enormously, it's this enormously fun feeling of control. But then, you get into real government, and you can't always necessarily do that. However, with all of the increasing surveillance technology that we have, more and more and more real life is coming to look like SimCity. More and more we are, in fact, constantly monitored by the government, and they know where we are, and they know what we're doing. And this becomes very, very dangerous, because there is almost no limit to the types of regulation that well-meaning progressive figures would like to impose on us, be it perhaps things to good end, like preventing terrorism, but also things that are arguably much, much more troubling, like watching how much fat or salt or sugar we consume, or watching what kind of religious beliefs we are espousing or acting on. And what we're seeing now is that technology is making possible a lot of very close monitoring of these sorts of things in ways that formerly they just didn't exist. You just could not manage to watch people this closely. Now with the rise of big data, with the rise of pervasive surveillance video, with the rise of cell phone tracking and all of the different things that are now available as technologies, what we're going to see is a tremendous push toward micromanaging people's lives. It's very, very dangerous, I would say.
The game, I was more of a Civilization 2 guy than a SimCity guy, but the principle's the same. When you're the ruler in Civilization, you get a little bar up, you set the tax rate, you set the investment in science, you allocate resources, you have in general infrastructure planning, things like that. Do you think that kind of this rise of technocracy doesn't take seriously enough the a lot of public choice economics, but also kind of the general fight against bureaucracy that you have in a massively centralized modern state like this?
Well, yeah, I mean, at some point we're going to have to decide what are the appropriate uses of technology like this. What are the maybe forbidden uses, the uses that we think are beyond the pale, and there's going to almost inevitably be a gray area. And this is going to be, I think, the shape of a lot of political controversies to come, whether a particular use for these sorts of technologies is right or wrong. One of the problems is that you cannot judge the use of a surveillance technology simply by the ends that it's hoping to achieve. So if I were to say we need this type of monitoring to stop terrorism, that's admirable. I don't think anyone could possibly say that that's bad, except of course for terrorists. The question then has to be, how effective is it, and what are the side effects? And very frequently it will be found that these sorts of technologies are not actually all that effective at stopping terrorism. For example, the whole body scanners that were used in airports, they are very easily defeated. They did not manage to stop any terrorists. The technology itself was widely abused by members of the TSA to look at people naked, essentially, which obviously, I mean, if we take all these things into account, rather than simply the good intention that initiated the policy, we end up with a very different conclusion. The problem is that this makes politics much more difficult, much more complicated. I think I hate to say this, but I think a lot of Americans' attention spans extend only to what the intent of the law is without looking at the consequences that follow from it, or even the negative consequences, which they ought to be worried about.
Yeah, so here's a question. In the internet age, it has seemed to me that we've discovered that Americans simply do not value their privacy very highly, right? I
don't know if it's that simple. There are ways in which I do value my privacy, and there are ways in which I don't. And it's not necessarily the case that a policy of maximum privacy is the best. It's perhaps the case that I want more control over the things that I do keep private and the things that I don't. And I may be very, very willing to share things that, for example, my parents are not willing to share. But that doesn't mean that my entire life should be an open book, or that I should not be able to ever exercise control.
No, that's absolutely correct. That yes, a lot of Americans do want more control than they have. But it seems like, and I think this might have just been, the early 90s, mid 2000s as the internet was growing. We all traded, and I'm not saying that this was a collective decision, but people increasingly traded their information for value. So when I go to Google, I have implicitly entered into a contract where Google's tracking me, and I'm giving them information about me, about my preferences, about whatever, so that they can sell ads. And
Right. I
by
mean, there's the old saying that if you're not paying for it, then you are the product.
yeah,
And that's very clearly the case. Google is benefiting from your search history, from the things that you click on or don't click on, to build up a profile of what you're like,
yep.
so that it can
And
sell things to you.
and
And
Facebook and lots of other internet companies do the same thing, and
exactly.
and they're all I say they're free of charge, but the cost of them is our privacy, is our personal information, and by and large, Americans have decided that that's a cost worth giving up. And I think that that is kind of a symbolic that, and maybe they don't realize it, in general, because it happened kind of subtly, but it seems like, as far as revealed preference goes, that's at least a data point that Americans simply don't value their privacy very highly.
It is a data point that Americans do not value their privacy in a way that one might have expected. We should be very careful, though, about what we interpret that point to mean, because while I might be happy giving my information to Google or to Facebook, and I do, I'm not necessarily so happy that they are then accessible by the NSA. I'm not necessarily so happy when they are collaborating with the government or are being themselves surveyed by the government in ways that I have no control over, and maybe that they have no control over. So, I mean, and the distinction between them is actually very, very clear. Google and Facebook can sell me stuff, and they can make offers to me, and I'm okay with that. The government, though, can do lots more than that. They're not interested in selling me products necessarily. They are interested in things that go well beyond that, and that include the power to arrest and to imprison. And we need to be very, very careful about how we think about that concept of privacy, because who gets your information and who uses it to what end is really, really relevant here. If I choose to share something with an online entity that's a private entity, they're limited. They're limited in what they can do to me. The government, not nearly so much. And what we've seen lately, especially in the social media age, is that what's called the third-party doctrine in privacy law has really, really, really come into question. The third-party doctrine says that when you share information that might otherwise be deemed private with a third party, you are no longer possessed of a reasonable expectation that will be kept private, and the government can, in fact, snoop on it. This is something that, in today's world, would strike the common person in the street as being either counterintuitive or just downright perverse. Attitudes have really changed about where that line needs to be drawn, and I think that what we really should see, I hope to see, is an erosion of this third-party doctrine, and a move toward a clear line being drawn between private or commercial entities and the government, and that's where I think the line needs to be drawn now.
Right. I think that you're generally right, and Americans do accept that distinction between, multi-billion-dollar mega national companies and the federal government, and we saw that in the PRISM revelations a couple months ago, where it was, oh yeah, I gave all my information and stuff to Google, but now I'm horrified that Google's sharing that with the NSA. And I suppose Americans are generally aware that, yes, they are giving all this information to private companies, but they do still appreciate that distinction between giant corporations and the federal government. And I think if I can call them the SimCity technocrats, would say, we are I'm in the government. I'm a benign person. I want what's best for American citizens. Why do you trust these giant corporations over the federal government? But I think there is still that libertarian-ish attitude that does say, yes, we do trust private companies still more than we trust the federal government.
Well, I trust private companies more for two reasons. First, because private companies don't have the power to imprison, and they shouldn't have that power. Well, and I'll add at this point, because I know someone will bring it up, I think that the trend toward privatizing prisons is actually pretty dangerous. But the power to commend someone to prison, to send them there, is something that should be very tightly controlled, and the way that we control it is by giving it to the government alone. So there's that. Google can't put me in prison. Facebook can't put me in prison. But also, if I decide that I'm fed up with the corporation, I don't have to do business with them. If I decide that I don't like Google's privacy terms, I can use other search engines. They do exist. DuckDuckGo is one that is very respective of the user's privacy, does all that they can to keep your search information private and to prevent it from being shared with outsiders or used in ways people find problematic. And if you care about these things, you are free to seek out another alternative. It's much harder to find an alternative government. People who are wanting to find a different government, where do you go? Where do you go? It's not easy.
Yes, yes. All right, well, I think that's all we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Jason. And I encourage everyone to go check out CATO Unbound, because that's a fantastic resource, and they have really interesting debates every month. But thanks for joining me, and I will see everyone next time on another episode of Rational Actors.